The mercury in the old glass thermometer nailed to the porch pillar didn't just drop. It plummeted until it vanished into the bulb. At the Fairbanks Meteorological Center, Dr. William Hayes stared at his satellite readouts in disbelief. A freak atmospheric collapse, a stationary high-pressure dome, had trapped a localized pocket of super-chilled stratospheric air over a remote valley in the Yukon Territory. The readings at O'Hara's Basin registered a deadly, incomprehensible 71 degrees Celsius, 95.8 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, physics begins to warp. Boiling water thrown into the air instantly vaporizes into a hiss of ice crystals. Steel becomes as brittle as cheap glass. Exposed human skin freezes solid in less than 40 seconds, the cells expanding and bursting like tiny water balloons. 72-year-old Margaret Sullivan was alone in the epicenter of this anomaly. Margaret was no stranger to the brutal realities of the North. A retired wildlife biologist, she had lived in the off-grid cabin at O'Hara's Basin for 24 years. The last 5, without her husband, Arthur, who had passed away from a sudden cardiac arrest in the very bed she now sat on. She had stayed to honor his legacy, meticulously documenting the behavioral patterns of the local timber wolf populations. But 24 years of experience meant nothing against 71 degrees Celsius. This was not weather. This was an extinction event. Inside the cabin, the heavy cast-iron diesel stove had been running red-hot for 3 days. But at 2:14 a.m., the rhythmic chug-chug of the fuel pump violently hitched. A sharp, metallic crack echoed through the quiet room. The extreme cold had penetrated the buried fuel line, freezing the microscopic condensation inside the diesel until the pipe simply ruptured. The fire died. Silence rushed into the cabin, heavier and more terrifying than any storm. Margaret watched the orange glow fade from the stove's belly. She knew the brutal math. The cabin's insulation would hold off the fatal drop for perhaps an hour. After that, the indoor temperature would equalize with the outside. She would fall asleep and never wake up. Her only hope was the secondary generator housed in a reinforced shed exactly 60 yards from the cabin's back door. It was an industrial beast powered by aviation-grade kerosene, which wouldn't freeze. If she could reach it, manually prime the engine, and pull the starter cord, she could activate the electric baseboard heaters in the cabin. 60 yards. In 71 degrees Celsius, it might as well have been 60 miles. She began the laborious process of armoring herself. Merino wool base layers, electric heated leggings, heavily insulated Carhartt overalls, 2 layers of down jackets, and a heavy parka lined with wolverine fur to prevent breath condensation from freezing to her face. She strapped on her husband's heavy Sorel glacier boots. Finally, she slung Arthur's customized 45-70 lever-action rifle over her shoulder and grabbed a heavy-duty magnesium flare. She stepped to the heavy oak door, took a deep breath, and threw the bolt. When Margaret stepped onto the porch, the cold didn't hit her like a wall. It hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The air was so dense, it felt thick, almost liquid. Every breath she took seared her lungs, tasting of ozone and iron. The world was utterly silent, save for the terrifying, explosive sounds of pine trees shattering in the forest as the sap inside them froze and expanded. She turned on her heavy-duty tactical flashlight. The beam struggled to pierce the dense ice fog, a phenomenon where water vapor freezes in the air, creating a suspended cloud of microscopic daggers. She stepped off the porch. Crunch. Crunch. Her boots sounded like they were breaking glass. 10 yards. 20 yards. The bitter cold was already penetrating her boots. Her fingers, encased in thick mittens, ached intensely. 30 yards. Halfway. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered. The cold was rapidly draining the lithium-ion battery. A second later, the bulb flared brightly and died, plunging her into the heavy, suffocating darkness. Only the faint, ghostly illumination of the starlight, filtering through the ice fog, guided her. Then, she heard it. It was not the sound of breaking trees. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of snow being compressed by weight. Not one set of steps. Several. Margaret froze. The wind shifted, carrying a scent she had documented for decades. The musky, pungent odor of wet fur. raw meat, and wild adrenaline. Out of the ice fog, a pair of pale yellow eyes materialized. Then another, and another. The Ghost River Pack. Under normal circumstances, timber wolves avoid humans. Margaret had lived alongside them for years without a single aggressive encounter. But these were not normal circumstances. The plummeting temperatures had decimated the local game. The moose had bedded down in deep cover. The hares were frozen in their burrows. The pack was starving, driven mad by a caloric deficit and the agonizing cold. Desperation had overridden their natural fear. To them, Margaret was no longer a human. She was simply heat and meat. They circled her, their movements eerily silent. Through the gloom, Margaret counted at least 7 large shapes. They were moving in a tactical formation, cutting off her retreat to the cabin and blocking her path to the shed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the sweat on her back turning to ice. She slowly unslung the .45-70 rifle, her thick mittens making the action clumsy. She cocked the lever. A massive, coal-black wolf, a beta male driven by sheer hunger, stepped into her limited field of vision, baring its teeth. The saliva instantly froze into long, terrifying icicles hanging from its jaw. It let out a low, guttural snarl that vibrated in Margaret's chest. Margaret raised the heavy rifle, aimed at the ground near the wolf's paws, and pulled the trigger, hoping the concussive blast would scatter them. Click. Nothing happened. Margaret stared at the weapon in horror. The firing pin, made brittle by the 71 degrees Celsius air, had simply snapped when the hammer struck it. She was holding a useless piece of wood and steel. The black beta male recognized the vulnerability. It dropped its head, its muscles coiling like a spring, preparing to lunge. Margaret dropped the rifle and fumbled for her magnesium flare, but her hands were too numb. The flare slipped from her grasp and buried itself in the deep snow. She backed up, her heel catching on a submerged stump. Margaret fell backward, landing hard in the snowdrift. The cold bit instantly through her layers. The pack surged forward. The black wolf leaped, its jaws snapping toward her throat. Margaret threw her arms up, bracing for the agony, closing her eyes and whispering Arthur's name. A roar tore through the frozen night, a sound so vicious and deafening it sounded less like a wolf and more like a derailed train. Before the black beta could reach Margaret, a massive force slammed into it mid-air. The impact sounded like 2 boulders colliding. The black wolf was thrown sideways, crashing into the snow with a yelp of pain and surprise. Margaret opened her eyes, gasping. Standing over her, breathing heavy plumes of white vapor into the frigid air, was a timber wolf of impossible proportions. It was significantly larger than the rest of the pack, its coat a grizzled mix of silver and gray. But it was the head that caught Margaret's eye. The right ear was torn down the middle, and across its massive chest was a distinct, diagonal scar devoid of fur, revealing a pale, jagged line of healed skin. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. 4 years ago, while checking automated trail cameras, she and Arthur had found a young male wolf caught in an illegal, heavy-gauge wire poacher's snare. The wire had bitten deep into the animal's chest, tearing its ear as it fought to escape. Most people would have left it or shot it out of mercy. Arthur had pinned the thrashing, terrified animal with a catchpole while Margaret, risking her own life and limbs, used heavy bolt cutters to sever the wire. The wolf had scrambled away, bleeding but alive. Arthur had named him Patch. Now, Patch was the alpha of the Ghost River Pack. The black beta scrambled to its feet, shaking off the snow, furious at the intervention. It bared its teeth at Patch, challenging the older wolf's authority. Starvation was pushing the pack toward mutiny. Patch did not hesitate. He didn't just fight. He unleashed absolute, calculated devastation. The alpha lunged, moving with a speed that defied his massive size. He bypassed the beta's snapping jaws, driving his shoulder into the younger wolf's chest and knocking it off balance. With a horrifying crunch, Patch's jaws clamped down on the beta's muzzle, violently twisting the black wolf's head and pinning it to the ice. The rest of the pack froze. The tension in the air was thicker than the ice fog. 2 younger wolves took a tentative step forward, testing the waters. Patch let out a rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground. his eyes locking onto the subordinates. He pressed his weight harder onto the beta, who was now whimpering, entirely subdued. Patch held the dominance display for 10 agonizing seconds. Slowly, the younger wolves lowered their tails. They dropped to their bellies, crawling slightly backward in a universal canine display of submission. Patch released the beta. The black wolf scrambled backward, coughing and submitting, joining the rest of the pack at a respectful distance. Margaret was paralyzed, both by the cold seeping into her bones and by the sheer awe of what she had just witnessed. She knew better than to anthropomorphize wild animals. Patch hadn't saved her out of a sense of human morality or Disney-esque gratitude. Wolves do not possess human sentimentality, but they possess unparalleled memories. They remember the scent of threats, and they remember the scent of entities that ease their pain. To Patch, Margaret was not prey. She was a strange, non-threatening anomaly associated with the release from a metal trap. Furthermore, as an intelligent alpha, he recognized that she was a source of something the pack desperately needed: access to the structures that sometimes emitted heat. Patch turned his massive head toward Margaret. His yellow eyes locked onto hers. He didn't growl. He didn't approach. He simply turned his body toward the generator shed, looking back over his shoulder at her. "Move," his body language screamed. Margaret scrambled to her feet, her joints screaming in protest. The numbness had advanced past her knees. She stumbled forward. As she walked, an incredible thing happened. The pack, following Patch's lead, flanked her. They didn't close in, maintaining a strict 5-foot perimeter. To an outside observer, it would look as though the old woman was walking her dogs. In reality, she was the epicenter of a deadly, fragile truce negotiated by the Alpha. She reached the shed. Her hands were clubs of unfeeling meat. She couldn't grip the metal handle. Patch stood a few feet away, watching her intently. Desperate, Margaret clamped both her forearms around the handle, using her body weight to pull. The heavy door shrieked in protest, ice shattering around the hinges, and popped open. She stumbled inside. The shed was marginally warmer, insulated from the wind. She collapsed next to the massive kerosene generator. Using her elbows and the palms of her frozen mittens, she awkwardly primed the fuel pump. She hooked her arm through the pull cord handle. She pulled. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Tears of frustration froze on her eyelashes. The cold was overwhelming. The lethargy was setting in the final, peaceful stage of hypothermia. She wanted to close her eyes. She looked toward the open doorway. Patch was standing there, his head framed by the swirling ice fog. He let out a sharp, demanding bark. The sound snapped Margaret back to reality. She gritted her teeth, braced her boots against the concrete floor, threw her entire body weight backward, and yanked the cord. The industrial engine roared to life. Instantly, the exhaust pipe that vented out the side of the shed began to blast hot air. Inside the cabin, 60 yards away, the electric baseboards would be glowing red within minutes. Margaret slumped against the vibrating, warming machine, sobbing dry, frozen tears. She spent the night in the shed, huddled against the running generator, the heavy metal door pulled almost shut, leaving only a small crack for fresh air. When the sun finally broke the horizon 8 hours later, painting the Yukon sky in violent shades of purple and gold, the temperature had warmed to 45 degrees Celsius. The worst of the atmospheric anomaly had passed. Margaret slowly pushed the heavy shed door open, her body aching, stiff, but miraculously alive. She looked toward the side of the shed where the hot exhaust pipe vented into the snow. There, huddled in a massive, interwoven pile of fur, was the Ghost River pack. They had spent the night sleeping in the blast of the hot exhaust gas, utilizing the heat she had provided. As the heavy shed door creaked open, Patch raised his head from the center of the pile. He looked at Margaret. He blinked slowly. Then, with a low groan, he stood up, shook the accumulated frost from his silver coat, and trotted off toward the tree line. One by one, the rest of the pack stood, stretched, and followed their alpha, disappearing back into the frozen wilderness. 5 days later, the sound of a twin-engine plane broke the silence of O'Hara's Basin. Bush pilot Jimmy Peterson landed his ski-equipped Twin Otter on the frozen lake near the cabin. He had been sent by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for what they assumed would be a grim body recovery mission. When Jimmy knocked on the cabin door, he was greeted by Margaret Sullivan, sipping hot black tea. Jimmy sat in her kitchen, staring at her in disbelief as she recounted the story. He walked outside, inspecting the dropped rifle with the shattered firing pin, the abandoned flashlight, and the heavy, overlapping tracks in the snow. "I've flown the bush for 30 years. Maggie," Jimmy muttered, looking at the massive paw prints surrounding the footprints near the shed. "I've seen bears share fishing spots with men, and I've seen wolverines run from house cats. But this..." He shook his head. "That old wolf didn't just save your life. He made a trade." Margaret looked out the frosted window toward the dark, silent tree line. "Yes," she said softly. "3 years ago, I gave him his life back. Last week, he returned the favor, and he made sure his family stayed warm in the process." Margaret Sullivan refused to leave O'Hara's Basin. She repaired her diesel heater and lived another 9 years in the deep wilderness, continuing Arthur's research. And while she observed the Ghost River pack many times through her spotting scope over the years, she never saw Patch up close again. He kept his distance, leading his pack through the harsh Yukon winters, a ghost in the snow, forever bound to the old woman in the cabin by a silent, unbreakable pact of survival.